Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening to those joining from elsewhere. I'm Lily McElwee. I'm a fellow in the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I'm really delighted to be hosting and participating in today's discussion on Chinese assessments of de-risking. This is the 8th public event that we're holding under the auspices of the Interpret China project here at CSIS. The Interpret project was launched with gracious funding from the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The intention is to enable a more productive and nuanced discussion of China's rise through translations and publications of primary source materials. And as part of that, we've been translating a handful of documents for today's discussion, looking at US, allied, and partner approaches to de-risking and implications for China, which you can find linked on our event page, as well as on our website, which is just interpret.csis.org. These pieces give us an indication of how Chinese expert analysts are assessing the adoption of the term de-risking, as opposed to decoupling as an operative terminology for economic and technology policy toward China, what de-risking means in practice, and what countermeasures China is taking or should take in response. And then we'll also evaluate the implications for the United States, Europe, and other advanced democracies going forward. We have a panel of esteemed experts on both sides of the Atlantic joining us this morning for today's discussion. We have Janka Oertel, who is the director of the Asia Program and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Andrew Polk, who is co-founder and head of economic research at Trivium China. Thank you, Janka and Andrew, for joining us today. They're going to help us unpack Chinese assessments of de-risking, drawing on the documents, but also drawing on other data points that they're looking at as they track US-China policy, EU-China policy, and Chinese and economic and foreign policy. One logistics note before we dive in, audience questions are welcome. We have a link to submit your question on the event page, and we encourage you to do so. We'll have part of our team monitoring that feed. So without further ado, based on my reading of the articles, and indeed we intentionally chose them for this reason, we wanted to look at both the adoption of the phrase de-risking, not decoupling, to describe economic and technology policies for G7 economies toward China, but also the concrete measures that the US, Europe, and other advanced democracies are taking to de-risk their economies from China's, and how Chinese scholars and Beijing are assessing these moves. So we'll focus on the first part of that conversation first. The term de-risking has really come into vogue after European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen first used it in a March speech on China. And it was quickly adopted by the Biden administration and by the G7 economies to describe foreign economic policy toward China. I'm wondering, based on the documents, but also other data points you're looking at, if we can start, Andrew, with you, the view from DC. What's your read on how Chinese analysts are assessing this rhetorical change? And do you think that aligns with how Washington is intending for this message to get through?
Thanks, Lily, for having me. Yeah, this is a really interesting discussion, and if I may, I think there's sort of several aspects to it. One is sort of a recognition among Chinese analysts and I think officials that U.S. policy has become more sophisticated in terms of what we're trying to achieve with either decoupling or de-risking. Secondly, there's the rhetorical shift and quite a nuanced understanding of kind of the de-risking term among the Chinese analyst community. Then there's what Chinese officials think about the de-risking term, and then there's what US business thinks. So I just want to quickly touch on each of those. I think both, before we get into the actual rhetorical shift, I think it's quite clear from the documents you all have interpreted or translated, and commentary in the Chinese policy space more broadly, that there's a recognition in China among both analysts, policy advisors, and policymakers that US policy, at least, is becoming more sophisticated. What I mean is we were taking a very broad brush approach, calls for just pulling back from China, full-scale decoupling, to now the Biden administration's clear focus really on kind of dependence on China in terms of raw materials and trying to reduce China's ability to advance itself technologically. So from this broad scale, like US business needs to get out of China, to really the small yard, high fence type of concept, and saying really the areas where we need to focus on are raw material dependence and the technological piece. So I think that shift is pretty well recognized throughout the Chinese policy space. And when it comes to de-risking versus decoupling, I think among Chinese analysts, there's a pretty sophisticated understanding of that shift. What I'll get to next is Chinese officials, where I think there's a less sophisticated understanding. I do think, at least in DC, there is a tendency in Washington to, if we can just get the messaging right, then the policy will be better accepted by both US constituencies and the Chinese. So I'm not 100% sure we've figured out what we mean by de-risking rather than decoupling, but so I think that's an ongoing development here in the US. But Chinese analysts are interpreting this. I think the two most interesting points that we've seen, one is that de-risking sort of makes the moving from decoupling to de-risking adds some ambiguity into the policy, because we're not sure what de-risking means exactly. And so in a way, it's an effort to appeal to various constituencies within both Europe and the US about what our China policies should be, right? So this is again how Chinese analysts are understanding the rhetorical shift. And I think that's right? So, a lot of people say, well, we can't decouple from China. We shouldn't decouple from China. But then you say, well, de-risk, well, that makes a lot of sense. Not quite sure what it means, but there's some ambiguity there. The second interesting point that I think analysts have made is de-risking both frames it more in terms of national security and sort of puts the onus on China in a way, right? So when you say decoupling, it's just we want to pull back and this is something we're choosing. When you say de-risking, you're saying, well, first of all, there's a threat. If there's a risk, there's a threat. So that means China's doing something that we need to be reacting to. And also, when you de-risk, you're talking about more, it frames it more in the national security realm, which is more acceptable, again, to constituencies in the US and in Europe. So that's an interesting understanding, I think, quite nuanced understanding among Chinese analysts, that they've kind of pointed this out. And I would say, even to the extent that that is happening in the US kind of policy thinking, it's almost an implicit understanding of what we're doing. That said, I think when Chinese officials hear de-risking versus decoupling, they say that the words don't matter. That's just, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it, any number of terms, but the policy is basically the same. And so, the rhetorical, machinations and semantics don't matter all that much. So there is an understanding in China, I think across the board, that our policies have become more sophisticated. Chinese analysts have quite a very specific and nuanced understanding of the rhetorical shift. I think officials in China, who are the ones making policy in response to us, just kind of view it as just painting the tiger with different color stripes. Last piece I will say is that US companies, who we talk with a lot, actually really have embraced the idea of de-risking and are actively looking at trying to very specifically define what de-risking means for them, and to try to action some of those strategies in the China market. So hopefully that puts out a framework that when we talk about this shift, there's a lot of different aspects to it and a lot of different constituencies that are thinking about it in different ways.
Thanks, Andrew. That's super helpful. And I think I definitely agree with you that it's really important to think about the perspectives here and the different stakeholders, because I think even within this set of articles that we've translated, I picked up on very different views of of what de-risking means, whether it's a positive development for China or not. I know that some of them kind of mirror what you described as maybe the feelings in Beijing of this is just sort of a continued, I think one said, desanitization of supply chains, right? It's the same thing. And then in the Jian Zhuanbo piece, there's a sense that, oh, actually maybe it's more dangerous, maybe it's a change, and that piece I think we should dig into more. Really focuses on Europe. So I'll hand it over to Janka for the view from Berlin.
Thank you, Lily, and Andrew, I agree with you a lot. The terminology has helped and hurt a little bit the clarity of messaging, and it is meaning everything. So you can have like a rule of thumb: if all the Europeans can agree on a term, it probably doesn't mean much because it's just the way this is done in European terminology. I would like to start by just kind of pointing out to some super basic facts. So first of all, China, neither the researchers nor the government want to be de-risked. They don't like the idea of being de-risked. That doesn't seem like something that they would say is a good idea or something that is in their interest. De-risking runs counter to Chinese interest as it kind of raises the risks for Beijing. It actually runs counter to their own de-risking strategy. If we de-risk, then they can't de-risk as effectively as we de-risk, or as they would like to de-risk. And I think that sounds a bit trivial, but it kind of points to a logical problem that we have here in Europe, particularly, because there is an actual trade-off, right? So it does seem at the moment that the Europeans are using the de-risking terminology to say, it's not that bad, everyone does it a little bit, and then we're all fine. But actually, the way we de-risk comes at China's cost. And I think that's what kind of Andrew Polk points out really nicely in his piece, sort of saying, it looks mild, but there are risks for us hidden in this. And we shouldn't fall into the trap that this is something better, that this is something that we shouldn't be worried about. It is a discursive trap, and it is something that kind of exerts moral superiority, which I think Andrew pointed out as well, to say, it just puts the onus on China. It's just China's a threat. Now, that's not something that the Chinese government nor the Chinese researchers would like to sign on to. And Andrew Polk calls it deceptive and dangerous. I think that's super indicative of how it's kind of being seen, deceptive and dangerous de-risking. It is super striking to me that the strategic ambiguity of de-risking is pointed out as something that is problematic from the masters of vagueness. Nail the pudding of the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, or the Global Civilization Initiative to the wall. I would like to see what sticks. So it is kind of quite striking to see that there is a call for clarity in the messaging by those that normally master this as their perfect strategy. And I think it's also interesting to see that China's own de-risking strategy, while not being named as such, is seen as necessary and proportionate, and also as reactive. So that tells me something about kind of the different versions of reality, the perceptions of reality that are just so strikingly different. The Europeans think they de-risk from China, the Chinese think they de-risk from the US, and the US thinks it de-risks from everyone. It doesn't seem like this is a very helpful starting point for a constructive conversation forward. But I think it is through all the text, the legitimacy of China's approach is not being questioned. The legitimacy and the necessity of the Chinese approach, we're just doing this because we have to, is sort of something that runs through like a little bit of a red thread. What I found striking from a Berlin perspective is that there is sort of an assumption that coordination and cooperation with allies is not only intended to enhance, but that it is also succeeding. That certainly looks different when you sit here in Berlin. I think Chinese researchers seem to significantly underestimate the internal divergences and the logical problems that cannot be papered over with conceptual vagueness in a way. So if allies want two different things, a veiled reference to all of that being de-risking is not going to do the trick. If there are diverging interests in what this actually means and which areas are going to be de-risked, then I think this doesn't help us that much. The securitization dynamic seems to be a concern on all sides, but also sort of an inevitability. What I found very striking in the Song Guoyu text was this kind of referencing of Ukraine as a test case for extreme scenarios, which is a bit of a veiled reference to a Taiwan scenario, of course. It's a veiled reference to a military escalation between the US and China, and the reference that on Ukraine, the US has crossed red lines with regard to sanctions policy and the use of its economic weapons that it has at hand, also kind of stakes out a certain kind of red line for China through a kind of through a proxy, so to say. I think that the one thing that also the texts sort of agree on is that there's sort of seen a short-term de-risking threat to China, but a longer-term decoupling as sort of less problematic, as the US would lose leverage and that time is on China's side. And I think we can debate whether that is actually the case with regard to productivity and climate impact and demographic development and all of these things. But there seems to be this perception of, well, if they want to continue to do this, they'll only hurt themselves in the end by doing that, because we will be able to, after a short period of time, kind of be more autonomous, and then actually we will wind up stronger. And this one sentence in there that I think is more striking for Europeans than it is for Americans, but it is about winning a competition. For Europeans, that's still sort of an alien concept. The question of systemic competition and this idea that one would want to win it, because if it's a competition, it's not about kind of an eternal game. It is about something that has a winner and a loser. That's a very uncomfortable narrative for Europeans that I think none of the authors are referencing, that the Europeans may just have a very different kind of understanding of what they would like to do. And I think, if I'm very honest, I think the text, particularly the Janka Oertel text, really doesn't get where the Europeans stand on this. It doesn't actually address any of the internal tornness on this, and the complexity of the de-risking narrative, which here is much wider than small yard, high fence. It's about market dependencies, it's about market risks, it is about risks that are emanating from our export dependencies. It is much wider than just where do we get the critical raw materials from in the future, and where do we build semiconductors. And I think that's something that probably we need to convey a bit better, how wide and how kind of broad the de-risking logic in Europe is actually being discussed. Maybe I'll end here, we can discuss more.
Thank you, Janka. That's fantastic, and I definitely want to dig in. I think what you both raised is that is the sort of multi-stakeholder nature of de-risking, and how that will be a challenge going forward for some of the implementation of these strategies. I think that's something that the authors do pick up, but I think with the unifying piece, it was interesting because Janka Oertel was saying that the term is more unifying and therefore it's more dangerous. But what I'm hearing from you is that it's more unifying, but that's sort of a lowest common denominator approach. And actually, because it's more unifying, more unifying term is less teeth. So in a way, that's just wrong. But definitely, I think it gives us the platform to dig in a little bit more into some of the challenges that Chinese analysts are anticipating for these de-risking strategies going forward. Because I think that though the Janka Oertel piece talks about de-risking as far more dangerous and potent, all of the articles talk about how there are going to be barriers to the US, Europe, and other advanced democracies pursuing de-risking strategies. And a lot of that has to do with the multi-stakeholder nature of it, different interest groups, differences within European member states, between European member states, and on a transatlantic level. So what I was thinking, and Andrew, you spoke a little bit about this before when you talked about how de-risking is viewed differently by different stakeholders within the United States. But I'm wondering, do you think that Chinese analysts are correct in assessing that de-risking will be difficult to implement, partly because different stakeholders feel differently about our approach to China and our approach to how far and fast those controls should go?
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, I think the Chinese analysts are right when they say that de-risking is a unifying term exactly because it is more ambiguous, right? It is unifying because it kind of means all things to all people. You can interpret it any way you want. It sounds softer, again, couched in national security terms. And that's, I think, why everyone, has glommed onto it. The US government heard the Europeans say it, and they're like, we like that. Let's, it just intuitively sounds softer, sounds more strategic, and again can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways. So I think indeed it is unifying for those reasons. I think it's ironic that, you know, the Chinese analysts' reaction is, if they're going to de-risk, this is still a threat to us. So what we need to do is de-risk ourselves, but also their de-risking isn't going to work anyway. So it's kind of like, well, how did that framework doesn't really kind of make sense in my mind. I think it will be a challenge to de-risk, and I still don't think the U.S. government necessarily understands exactly, or has articulated at least, what they mean by that. That's why it would be a challenge. I mean, it's hard to accomplish something that you haven't defined success. Accomplish something where there is no specific goal. But I will say, again, I go back to the companies piece of this. Companies really do. They've never wanted to decouple, but they do want to de-risk. And so, to the extent that the de-risking framework, ambiguous as it may be, kind of creates a permission structure in a way for companies to say, we're not leaving China, we're just trying to make sure that we're adjusting our operations so that we, you know, are mitigating risks globally, and China is a part of that. That I think companies on an individual basis will be able to achieve, but we're at the very, very early stages, right? Some companies are saying, well, you know, I need to localize China operations more. I need to firewall communication and data flows between global and China. Some are saying I need to make my next marginal investment, you know, outside of China, in Southeast Asia or wherever. But so I think at the individual entity level, it can be quite successful, which, if aggregated up, means the overarching policy, as I think we understand it from the US side, could also be successful. But again, it's sort of more of a grassroots up development rather than a strategic, clear pathway that the US as a, you know, government is pursuing. So hopefully I'm not parsing that too much, meaning I'm not sure if the government policy itself from the US side can be successful, because we don't know what that means. But insofar as it creates a framework and a permission structure for individual companies to start making different decisions, it could ultimately be successful from a bottom-up standpoint. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And I think I mean, personally, it's one of the things that these articles in particular, and I think Chinese analysts overall, might be missing. There's kind of an underestimation of how much Chinese moves have incentivized de-risking, both at the governmental level, but particularly at the business level, in terms of a shifting and very uncertain regulatory climate and direction in China. I wonder if I could just follow up on that. You mentioned that there's this kind of organic desire to de-risk from businesses on the ground. And we clearly know that it's a government priority. Is there appetite among the businesses you're speaking with for greater consultation and coordination between businesses and between so they have a supportive regulatory framework and incentives in place for them to de-risk?
Yes, there absolutely is. You know, business certainly wants to be talking to government about this type of thing. I think, you know, maybe this is colored by my perspective of who the companies that I work with, or the clients that we have, but I would say businesses, you know, I think it's a pretty fair to say businesses have less of an impact on the policy space when it comes to China than they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because national security concerns are now clearly at the fore and are trumping economic and business concerns. And so, you know, when the NSC first adopted the de-risking language, which was back in April, I was at a dinner with NSC officials and some senior business folks, and it was the first time I had heard someone say it, you know, explicitly. We don't want to decouple, we want to de-risk. Looking around the room at the business people at the table, it was clear when the shift first started that they didn't understand what that meant, and they also did not see actions meeting the rhetorical shift from the U.S. government. And also there was a sense like, and so that the NSC kind of gave their remarks. The business leaders went around and said, well, please keep this in mind. Here's what we're thinking. And the attitude generally seemed to be like, okay, your feedback is noted from national security officials. So all that is to say, yes, businesses, I think at this point, are very much making decisions sort of in reaction to and in spite of government aims, right? They're like, how do we navigate this new geopolitical climate? They'd love to have more of a voice at the table and have a clear framework. But I think the reality is, at this point, there is less of a voice for business in China policy because, and that's, right or wrong or good or bad. It's because national security now trumps business interests in a very significant way. And so I'm not sure if we'll ultimately get to square that circle.
Janka, I would say the German business community gets a lot of attention when we talk about EU-China policy. Would you agree that Andrew was saying that businesses are having less of a seat at the table in the overall direction here? Would you agree that that trend is mirrored in Europe? Or, I was struck by your comment that if all Europeans can agree on a term, then it probably doesn't mean much. I wonder if you could just give us sort of a lay of the land of European debates on de-risking.
I was joking a little bit to make that clear, but it's often there's often some truth in that. So the point that Andrew is making, that for companies, de-risking is a logical term. Right? They continuously operate with risk. And they have navigated an environment in the past few decades in which politically the risk has been taken out of the market. They had been operating under conditions where politically, particularly from a European perspectives, we were making sure that the political level, political relations between China and Europe, between China and Germany was stable so that they can do business. We sort of artificially took risk out of the market that was existing. I mean, the legal framework in China hasn't changed that much. It has changed a bit, but it was always sort of risky to do business in China if you don't have any political backing for what you are doing. And it could be gone and over from one day to the next, and you are still withheld by like all of the different problems that you're facing, from corruption to kind of regulatory unclarity and all of these matters. None of that has, some of these things have been enhanced, but none of this was non-existent before. So I think it's important to say we have had a condition where politically we wanted to keep the risk down. And now we're in a zone where the kind of externalization of this risk onto society, onto politics, is no longer preferable for governments, where they say, we're actually no longer willing to take this political risk for you. We're telling you that this is difficult, the conditions are dangerous. You have to take that risk yourself. If you believe as a company that you can handle the risk of being dependent on the Chinese market without it creating a serious challenge to societal stability in Europe, in our countries, to jobs in Germany, to jobs in France, then go for it. But we're not going to bail you out. That's part of the German-China strategy right now. Now, that's obviously a slight bluff, because in the end, if there's a huge German company going lopsided in China, then I want to see the government that stands up and says, no, we'll just sacrifice 30,000 jobs for this. That's fine. That's probably not going to work that way either. But I do think that the messaging is a very different one. And this is where I think the de-risking idea is a bit of a challenge for everyone, because in the end, it's not about de-risking, which means that there is a state of being de-risked, right? There is a state of being risk-free. There is a changing in risk prioritization. And I think this is where the big conversation now needs to start. And that needs to be a political and societal conversation, and cannot be a conversation at company level. Now, companies need to do their own risk management strategies. But for some companies, as Andrew said, this can mean doubling down on the China market, localizing their supply chains, making sure that they isolate their businesses, that they are able to split their companies off just in case something goes wrong. And that's a tendency that we're seeing, whereas German investment into China is currently going up. This is a handful of companies that are kind of localizing and that are doubling down on existing investments to de-risk their own business. Now, whether that is in the societal interest or not, I think is a different story. And this is where the complicated conversation then starts, of saying who can actually make the judgment call on which risk is correct for a society. Can that be business, or does it have to be politics? Because necessarily, if you de-risk one area, another one may go up. If you say we don't want to be dependent on Chinese solar panels anymore, therefore we will stop importing them and we will get them from somewhere else, and there is a gap that in terms of the supply, well, then the climate risk may go up. If you say that you want to make sure that you have if you want to say, what are the largest risks that we may need to look into, then I would say it's probably not the solar panels or CRMs, it's probably our medical supply chain. It's probably the antibiotic supply chain, where you say, well, I mean, the societal damage this could do in a short term is huge. If the Chinese government decided not to export these medical products any longer, these pharmaceutical products any longer, we could have turmoil, societal turmoil in Europe pretty quickly. And that is a problem here. So if I were a politician, I'd probably de-risk that one first. But that's a judgment call you make on not a kind of objective risk assessment. But this is super subjective, and this is going to be different in each of the European member states as well. So what I've likened it to so far is it's like a DJ on it has to mix the right sound, the right risk sound, right? Get the bass right, get the height right. And every sound in every European country is going to be slightly different because you're prioritizing slightly different things. You see some other things more as a threat than other things. And that's something where the challenge for Europe in comparison to the US and Japan, who can do their own de-risking and get their sound right and then stand there, we have to make sure that not every country gets their sound right, but that also there's no dissonance then, massive one, between all the European countries within the EU. And I think that's where I think you can use the term de-risking and then say all of these things are sort of in that, but that doesn't get to the heart of the really big political, difficult problem of making choices that are all suboptimal under really shitty conditions. None of these de-risking choices are going to be great. And so they're going to have costs and someone is going to pay them. And so I think this is where I'm so cautious by saying, well, this is just a company job and small yard, high fence is going to do the trick, because that seems to me a slightly too technical solution to a pretty big political problem that we're facing.
Can I just jump on a couple of those are all great points, Janka, and I just wanted to kind of re-emphasize a couple of those. I mean, absolutely, this is a collective action problem, right? Companies are going to de-risk in their own way, and that's why government policy here is so important. If the policy of whatever, if the de-risking goal or the de-risking policy is not clearly articulated, it could lead to some really serious unintended consequences, because if companies are just pointed in a direction and said go de-risk, they may do it in a bunch of different ways, some of which may mean, as we've talked about, that they cozy up further to the China market. Because when they say de-risking, they're talking about how do we maximize profit? How do we take the risk out of the idea that we're going to make less money? And some of that, of course, is like, sometimes you'll make less profit in order to take a catastrophic outcome off the table. So maybe that does mean reducing exposure to China. But this is why articulating the policy so clearly, or more clearly, is so important. And the other thing I just wanted to say is, it works in both Europe and the US's favor that China's economy is struggling right now. Because if China was still growing at 6, 7, 8%, companies would be pushing, they'd say it's worth the risk. The reason that companies are willing to de-risk is because the returns in China are going down and risks across the board are going up. So the risk-adjusted returns are now vastly lower than they were before. If that wasn't the case, I think companies would just say it's worth it for us to just continue dealing with these high risks because we're making so much money here. And so that's an important caveat here. And I guess doubly important is, without derailing too much on this, China in 2023, I think, is growing much more slowly than it will in 2024 and maybe 2025. Like there is some room for China to come back a little bit, and that also might shift companies' calculations next year, the following year, if growth does improve kind of on a cyclical basis. So there's a lot in flux here, and that's why clearer articulation of the policy, I think, from the government level is so important.
Thank you both. I want to turn to the Chinese side in terms of what countermeasures these analysts are recommending for China, and some that Beijing has taken already. I know that the article suggests that there's quite a diversity of recommendations here about how to react. And I want to get your sense of where you think the policy in Beijing is heading right now. If you look at the Lu Feng piece, it's saying decouple, decouple, decouple. The US, EU, they're decoupling. What we need to do is be completely technologically self-sufficient, get our domestic semiconductor supply chain fully closed loop, and cut out first US and then all other components, foreign components. But if you look at the, I think it's the Gu Xueming piece, the MOFCOM affiliated authors, they strike a much softer tone. Instead of self-sufficiency and retaliation, it's engagement. Let's try to shape the scope and scale of de-risking through dialogue and through, I think one of the articles mentioned sort of discourse power shaping how de-risking is perceived as a strategy in the West. I personally see indications of all of this happening at once. If you look at, for example, Premier Li Qiang's visit to Berlin, where he spoke with CEOs, he said, you know, it's businesses who should be deciding de-risking, not governments, and please keep it as narrow as possible. But of course, technological self-sufficiency has been a focus for a long time, for almost the past decade, if not more. And you know, if you just look back to the 2014 National Semiconductor Strategy, a goal there was essentially what Lu Feng is recommending. So, and then there's the retaliation piece as well. And we've seen export controls on germanium and gallium, these sort of like testing the waters moves for retaliation for certain technology and economic control. So I personally am seeing all three pieces. But Andrew, you're speaking with businesses all the time on the ground. I'm wondering what your perspective is on you know, where you see Beijing's policies going.
I agree with you. I think, you know, there's not just one approach, it's a little bit of everything. And, you know, that's pretty classic in Chinese policymaking. You know, you kind of have a basket of measures of various tools in the toolkit that you pursue all at once. I think fundamentally, right, the reaction has been to invest in the domestic industrial base more, right? To sort of take a medium-term view of what the Chinese view of as economic coercion, particularly by the United States, but also by the Europeans. And so that's number one. Let's just invest at home. And like, there's really only one way out of this. And this is for us to develop our own innovation and technological capabilities. Number two has been divide and conquer. And that's always the, you know, China's approach with Europe, right? Internally is to try to keep the disparate voices in Europe disparate and to you know, keep from a unified strategy from moving forward. But they've also done that, you know, with the US and its European allies and other allies, right? Particularly with the export controls. The number one thing they did in response to the October 7th export controls was immediately charm offensive with the Dutch, the Japanese, and the South Koreans. And when that didn't really work, then only then did you see them start to think about retaliatory tools with, you know, germanium and gallium. And by the way, I think our view is that the game there is now like, okay, now we have a retaliatory tool. We tried to keep you from joining the US on the export controls. We recognize that that didn't work. But now that we have a tool, the game now is let's negotiate on implementation. How aggressive is Japan, the Dutch, is Japan and the Netherlands going to implement those export controls? So there's still a negotiation there. I think the last piece is what you don't see a ton of actually is retaliation, because China doesn't have a ton of retaliatory tools. You know, what we would say when the export controls first came out was, you know, China's ultimate goal is to maintain access to Western technology in the short term, and they cannot retaliate their way to that goal. So, you know, retaliation doesn't really achieve their aims for the most part. And so I think they're going to be relatively, in the near term, relatively reticent to to retaliate because it doesn't achieve the aims that they're looking for. When I say retaliate, I mean direct retaliation by implementing severe export controls themselves and punishing foreign companies operating in the market. That would be cutting off their nose to spite their face. So I agree with you. A bunch of different, approaches, but I think fundamentally they understand at the end of the day, the only way out is through. And so domestic, support and investment has to be the bedrock of the response.
Mm-hmm. And can I just ask,
maintaining as much as access to Western technology as possible. And this is where I would like to go back to the point of China does not want to be de-risked. If we say the companies should do this, then we need to also keep in mind that the Chinese government has a number of tools at hand to make this de-risking process of companies a lot less attractive to the company. You can play at the company level and make very attractive offers to individual companies that are still desired to be in the Chinese market, and that's going to run counter. And so if you just say as the government, we would kindly ask you to de-risk, and then the Chinese government says, well, we don't. So we have a nice little offer, counter offer for you on the table. I want to see the company that is capable of handling that properly. I think that's going to be incredibly difficult. And I think it's the Dufang piece, right? The last sentence, I think, is really important. At this time, the more China backs down, the more blows it will receive. Therefore, at this time, China's fist must be hard and it must have the power to choke its opponent's throat. It's working on that power. The longer Western companies are supporting that, obviously, the more powerful those hands are going to get. And I think this is the kind of de-risking conundrum that Europeans find themselves in at the moment, that they're not so sure how they're going to get out of the stranglehold while they're trying to not strengthen the fists additionally around their throat. So the end goal is very clear. And now I think the question for us from the Chinese side, the end goal is very clear. It's like having enough power to make sure that the US cannot use its economic tools to force you to do things you don't want to do. That seems to be relatively obviously the goal. So if that is the goal, then the question to me is, does a kind of a policy that withholds certain technologies, etc., does that make the process faster or slower? And we have very different narratives about that in Europe and in the US, of saying, well, if we don't give them certain technologies, they're only going to develop them themselves. But then the other question is, aren't they going to do that anyway? And aren't they going to get there faster if we continue to export? So I think that's not resolved yet, all of these questions in our approach. But I do think that, looking at some of the texts and some of the way these things are phrased, also in a very aggressive fashion, in a struggle fashion, in a classic, much more classic winner-loser, winner-takes-all fashion. I think that's really worth looking into for policymakers at the moment to understand what the end game is supposed to be, because the Chinese are really clear about the end game.
Janka, can I follow up on that? So what you're talking about is sort of a firm level outreach, making it really attractive for certain firms to stay in China. And of course, that affects interest group politics. It affects how democracies make decisions. But do you think that Chinese policymakers are sort of taking a second look at their approach to Europe? I was struck by the fact that the EU trade chief, when he went to China last month, said that one of the things he wanted to do was drive home this point of how China's essentially de facto alignment with Russia and the war in Ukraine was affecting European public opinion and European approaches to de-risking. And I was struck by that because that's a message that European leaders have been trying to get home for so long, get through to Chinese leaders. And I'm just wondering, do you think that, if we take the Jian Zhenbo piece, his argument is the game's over in Europe, they're de-risking, they're unified. Do you see any change in how Beijing is approaching member state politics these days?
So there's a short-term and a long-term question here, and there's a peacetime and a wartime logic here. At times of peace, in which you can still have kind of normal economic interactions, Europeans can be charmed can be useful for technology exports, can be nicely as fissionable material, right? You can nicely split them, and you can nicely have them work against each other and against their own interests as well. And that really works. We have to be very honest about that. And I think we've seen a lot of that over the past few months and the last year, that any little glimpse of hope that China would act on Russia, just has to say something that is a really non-important statement, and everyone's like, well, maybe they are going to help us. Maybe they are going to use their powers on you see it on kind of the current discussions on Hamas and Israel and all of that as well. Maybe the Chinese can play a constructive role. This hope is so alive still in European capitals that any kind of gesture towards that will be seen as a very positive gesture and will be seen as something. But that's more a short-term question. I don't think that there's any dissonance in the Chinese system and among experts as well, that if there is a confrontation between, if there is the extreme scenario that the text talks about, there's absolutely no doubt whether Europeans fall. And I think that's a correct assessment. There is no doubt whether Europeans would fall, either reluctantly or choosing that, but they would have to choose sides, and they would choose a side, and they would know which side to choose. So I think that's a pretty correct assessment, that there's these different kind of, there's this short-term, long-term, and there's the wartime, peacetime, and this will make different options possible in approaching Europe, but there's no big question about which kind of, if you open the drawer, kind of, if you have the matrix, say wartime, you open the drawer, you stick the Europeans in, you sling it close, and it's the US drawer that you sling them in. So, so I think that's it doesn't really help us that much to think about it in those terms. I think for us it is more important, how can we stretch that time in which we think that there is, how can we make sure that we de-escalate all of the relationships so much there is not this extreme scenario that one would have to look into, in which the choices for everyone are just really terrible.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. I want to give us a chance to reflect on implications for the US and Europe. But before I do, Andrew, I'm wondering if I could ask you very quickly. You mentioned that the scope for retaliation is low. And I'm just wondering, on the ground, I asked Janka about Beijing's awareness of how much its de facto alignment with Russia is affecting perceptions in Europe. But I think one thing that you've discussed, and that's really missing from the pieces, is the role that the direction Xi Jinping has taken the Chinese economy and the national security ecosystem and the regulatory environment is playing in on-the-ground business decisions. I'm wondering if you can just give us a quick overview of how much you think that, what are the key regulatory risks, and how much do you think that those are driving business decisions?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I think risks have gone up across the board in companies' minds and in companies' realities. So there's several aspects of operating in China that have gotten more difficult. There's obviously the COVID years, and I think companies are still just sort of reeling from that, and having seen, very explicitly the level of control that the Chinese government's willing to, or the lengths that the Chinese government is willing to go to when it needs to control something. And we all knew that, but it just, with the Shanghai lockdowns, et cetera, it just became so stark and clear and obvious that I think has just scarred the mentality of businesses operating in China, and it's also reduced their headcount in terms of foreign employees being stationed in China. Then you add to that the tightening of information flows and data flows, right? So it's harder to get good information on what's happening in your business, what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the Chinese economy. It's also, the data economy and data governance is very much in flux. What data you can collect, what data you can house, what data you can ship offshore. So that's a huge risk. Of course, the emphasis of security also, does not go unnoticed, and does impact businesses as well. There's Xi Jinping has said, for 40 years, we thought development led to security. Well, guess what? Now security leads to development. So, inherent in that is, national security trumps the economy. And so those types of efforts will come first. And if the economy doesn't grow as fast, so be it. So that's impacting businesses. The lower economic growth rates impacting businesses, and geopolitical tensions are impacting businesses increasingly. What they do in China gives them blowback at home. And so I would say all of these things are just the risks have gone up across the board. And that's why everyone's saying we need to de-risk and proactively. And it's also why companies are just, US companies in particular, are maybe not deathly afraid, but just so worried that the Chinese are going to start retaliating more directly. And that may ultimately come to fruition. It's not now, because like I said, I don't think the direct retaliatory tools either are very strong or achieve their aims. But at some point, Chinese, officials, Xi Jinping on down, may say, we just got to start extracting pain from the foreign business community in order to see if we can change the dynamics. So hopefully that answers your question. It's partly the national security, but there's just a phalanx of risks that have increased significantly, and that has led to companies just constantly looking over their shoulders, saying, when is the hammer going to drop on us from the Chinese side?
Well, and the Lu Feng piece says technology may be, he focuses on US power, but the market is our power, right? I think he says nuclear power, actually. So it's this very martial, well, we're going to start retaliating on a firm level. And we already see that ecosystem being built out with the unreliable entity list, for example, and, direct.
Well, and he names ASML, I believe, right? And says, well, we'll just say that they can't sell anything in the China market, and I mean, which is a very radical, approach, but eventually that kind of idea could gain currency, and you could see some, moves in that direction. I think I agree with Janka. In the short term, it's more inducements. Hey, let's keep you guys here. Mm-hmm. But you cross some Rubicon where we don't know where that Rubicon is. Suddenly things may flip, and Chinese officials may say, nope, we're going a different path. We're just going to start hammering these companies.
Mm-hmm. And you can use that as well, right? You can use one company to kind of state an example and say, yes, this is what we can do to you, and you other guys, you better behave, because this is otherwise what happens to you. And this is, I think, what Europeans are particularly worried about, that individual European companies are going to be singled out because they're an easier target than American companies, because in the end, you don't want the full force of the US government behind. But if you have like a Dutch government, then potentially you can handle it. So I think it's very reasonable as a choice. It sends a message, and that's a very clear message that then is being picked up by companies.
Mm-hmm. We have about 4 minutes left. I want to give each of you a chance for some closing remarks. Just, I think, thinking about how all of these strategies are somewhat in play, the sort of push for technological self-sufficiency and decouple on the Chinese side, a little bit of retaliation, but definitely scope for more down the line, and active engagement with stakeholders that Beijing deems more influential and able to influence the direction of de-risking policies. What do you think policymakers in, maybe Janka, will start with you, Brussels, Berlin, should be thinking about as they think about the future of de-risking in a way that reduces national security risks, retains European economic competitiveness?
I think we need to talk about de-risking in those three different layers properly, right? We need the import de-risking. So what are things that we need from China that we can de-risk from? What are things that are easy? What are things that are long-term? So that we have a hierarchy of de-risking. That way we can say, those are the actual easy things. You just throw money at the problem and you have it solved, and it actually is a real problem. And then there are areas where you may have a high dependency, but it isn't a real big problem. So you can continue to have that and save costs on that. And then you have long-term ones like CRMs, etc., where you need to invest now to be able to drive that risk down, so like very, very slowly over time. That's the import dimension. Then there's the export dimension, where at the moment the Chinese are doing the job on the de-risking. I think Andrew has related to that as well. They're buying less anyway at the moment from Europe. So that is going down by itself. The market de-risking, that's one that is very specific to the Germans, where you have companies that have 40% of their sales in China and that are so dependent on doing that. And this one is also one where the de-risking is already taking place through means of the Chinese market itself. And yeah, I think it's now important for policymakers to make clear to companies that not only is the Chinese cake not growing at the same pace as it was growing before, also the slice that Europeans are going to have of it is going to shrink. So this is not about replacing an imaginary Chinese market of the future. So it's not about where in the world is Volkswagen going to sell 40% of its cars in the future. But it is about the fact that it isn't going to sell 40% of its cars in China any longer. So finding mechanisms, measures of transforming companies, of developing new markets, and the whole diversification logic. And I think this is where the complexity of the de-risking is really it has to go beyond small yard, high fence to make sense for a proper approach that embeds all of these different logics and takes the Chinese policies really into account, because doing our own de-risking without actually looking into China's endgame and Chinese goals, and which I think I've laid out in your translations very, very clearly, will necessarily fail. And so I think that's where I think it's really good that you're doing this work, and please send that to all the capitals in Europe. 7+1 you can use to kind of infiltrate with knowledge.
Wonderful. I'll get the emails from you later on. Andrew, you mentioned that companies are already thinking about de-risking on the ground. Potentially greater coordination from Washington is necessary. Just any final remarks on recommendations for policymakers in DC?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think policymakers kind of need to think like companies on this one, which is, companies, when they're de-risking or trying to put forth their de-risking strategies, first, they're trying to define what exactly that means. What are the steps we need to get there? And then how will we know we've done kind of enough? And so clear definition, absolutely. But also outlining, how far de-risking needs to go and what cannot be de-risked. What is not national security? And I know that, senior officials are thinking seriously about that, but that's not enough a part of the conversation. It almost seems like maybe you could back into the de-risking goal or definition by saying, okay, well, lighters for cigarettes, we're not going to try to de-risk that. That doesn't matter. Pens, cardboard, and then you get whatever, you get bigger and bigger. And then at some point you say, okay, we'll draw the line here. I mean, we mentioned the obvious. It's obvious what does need: raw materials, some technologies, medical supply chains. Fine, that's all in the bucket. Now let's define a bunch of stuff that's out of the bucket, and then we do the hard work of defining, where the marginal cases are and what we're comfortable with. And until we do that, I think it'll be hard to really achieve success in achieving de-risking, because we haven't clearly defined it.
I think it's very clear that this is an active conversation, and we'll find out a lot more going forward. But I'm so grateful, Andrew and Janka, for your time this morning, this afternoon in Europe. And thanks to everyone for joining us. You can find the articles that we've been discussing on the event page and on the Interpret China website, and we hope you continue to follow our events going forward. Thank you.